There are books that I have put off because they have a reputation for being hard. There are things that I still put off because they intimidate me a little bit. But I read a lot, and I read a lot of things that people think of as being hard. In fact, I've never not read something just because it has a reputation for being hard. I might just put off when I try to read it. And so I've realized, I feel like there's a pattern. There's three things that I see that make books that have a reputation for being hard to read. And I feel like two of them, it is still worth reading under the right circumstances. One of them I feel like does not respect the time of the reader, and I don't recommend it. So I wanted to give examples of each of these that I feel like illustrate it really well. And in the first category, we have Borges, who he has a reputation for being hard to read because some of his stories have concepts that are very counterintuitive to most people, very hard to grasp. But his language, I was shocked. His language is really clear, and he is really concise. I understood what was happening in the stories. What is hard about Borges is getting all the implications, because he's grasping at, one of my big interests is emergent order, and a lot of his stories are grasping at it. And so I learned about him in undergrad. He had a reputation for being hard to read. People also treat him as a magical realist, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who, that's a story for another time, but I don't think he's anything like Marquez. And so between those things, I just put him off until Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who is probably my favorite living nonfiction writer, talked about how much he liked Borges, and then I finally read him, and I'm like, wow, Borges is really easy to read, and I relate to a lot of what he talks about. I read this whole thing. I also read most of his nonfiction and most of his poems in the same Penguin series here. And in his nonfiction, he talks about his philosophy of writing, trying to be as clear and concise as possible, which he is, and I agree with it. I also, reading his nonfiction, I'm like, wow, I really relate to Borges as a person. His poetry, too, somewhat. But anyways, so I think something like this, it's worth reading, and in this case, you can't prepare for it. There are things where it's difficult to read if you don't have the conceptual grounding. A good example of this is Athens and Jerusalem, which I don't have by Lev Shestov. I tried to read that. You need a lot of philosophical background that I don't have to really understand that. And so I thought I was getting some of it, and then at the end I was like, not really. I got a few things. And so that one, I'd say you probably don't read it unless you get the background. But Borges, there's nothing you can do to prepare. Just read it, follow along, and see what you can get out of it, which is sort of similar to how I approach, there's a science fiction writer. He's a computer scientist who really likes math, I think, Greg Egan. He has a reputation also for being hard. And I'm like, I don't try to follow all the math concepts in his stuff. If I get it, great. But I feel like he's trying to convey a feeling for it, not make you understand it on a rational level. And either way, I'm reading it for the story and for the feeling, for the journey. And so that's how I read Greg Egan, and I don't struggle with him because I'm not trying to get everything out of it. I'm just trying to get what I can out of it. And you can always come back to it if you are better prepared later. So that's the first category, is stuff that is clearly written, but the concepts themselves are hard, either because they are inherently hard for most people or because you are coming in unprepared. And then at the opposite extreme, you have Michel Foucault, who... So I read Borges, as I said, because of Taleb. I read Foucault mainly because of David Graeber, though there are some other people I kind of respect who really like him as well. I tried to, because I was reading this book, and I think I got one chapter in, and I'm like, I get what you're saying, but I'm translating it, like translating the translation, which is in English, and having to look up some of the untranslated Greek words as well, because there's like and so I'm getting what you're saying, but I feel like you could write the same thing less than half the length and a lot clearer. And then I put this on pause, decide if I want to keep reading it, talk to people who know Foucault, and they're like, oh yeah, he did this intentionally. He said they won't take me seriously if I don't write in a way that's hard to read, because that was the state of French academia. And okay, maybe he felt like he needed to do that, but as a reader, I feel like that is not respecting my time. And he's not wrong that people do tend to undervalue. If something is clear and simple in principle but hard in execution, there are a lot of people who undervalue that because they think, oh, this is too simplistic, it's not taking all the details into account, or it's, why is it not giving me all the steps to do this? But I feel like just as a writer, someone who tries to write myself, right, I don't care if it makes people with, high reputations respect me more. I want to be as clear in conveying my ideas as possible. And so I don't really have a lot of patience for this. Obviously, when he's out of copyright, you could have a translation. I'm going to make a video on translation because that's an interesting topic, where it's getting the spirit of what he says and not the letter. And I read that for sure. And maybe you can convince publishers to do it while it's in copyright by saying, Anglo-Americans prioritize directness and you need that for an Anglo-American audience. I don't know. But until that happens, until there's a translation that keeps the spirit but gets rid of the deliberately obtuse language, I am not reading Foucault. And fortunately, I don't have to because I'm not an academic, much less in a department that would require that. On the other hand, you have a different French philosopher, Jean Baudrillard, who I read him, and so there's a bit of Borges where it's like some of these ideas themselves are inherently complicated, but the main thing that makes Baudrillard hard to read is he is really dense. So when you're writing, this, that, and the other thing, pick two of the three. So with writing, you can have clarity, you can have concision, or you can have completeness in terms of the nuance in what you have. And you can pick two of those. And so Baudrillard picked concision and comprehensiveness, completeness, nuance. And so this is really dense in terms of what he is describing. And I can follow the language. I think a lot of people might struggle with the language. The concepts, again, a little bit, you have the Borges thing where they're a little bit hard too, but the main thing that makes this hard to read is just that he tried to keep the complexity while being as concise as possible. And I have a blog, I have these videos. The thing I make the biggest trade-off on now is complexity, because I'm like, okay, if it's interesting to people, I can come back to the details later. But what I had been trying to do was to sacrifice on the concision, and that just gets me lost in a morass of trying to account for everything. And so I definitely, if you're interested in what Baudrillard or Borges are saying, I recommend reading them. I personally would not read Foucault, but those are the three ways that books that have reputation for being hard can be hard in my experience. And there might be others, but those are the three I've noticed, which are, again, the underlying subject matter is difficult either because it's inherently difficult for people or you're not prepared, or they are deliberately writing in an obtuse fashion, like Foucault, or they are writing in a very dense fashion. And also, I guess you have just people who don't edit their writing really well. I suppose that's a fourth category. But they don't tend to have the same reputation for being hard. And there are books that people find hard, but they don't have a reputation for being hard. But in terms of books that have a reputation for being hard, these are the three things that I have noticed. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I will see y'all in the next one.